have this sense all the time, like there's something that we've lost. And like, I'm like groping, looking. And let's call it like how to live as beings on this planet, for example. And I have this sense that, like, I know that it's there. It's like, I don't know, it's like I have this like memory somehow, like I'll catch little glimpses of it and like recognitions. I know that it's there, but I feel like I'm like walking blind, right?
Good. The mailbox is a good reference. So at about that height,
Yep.
take your hand
Yep.
and move it slightly to the left
Okay.
until you eventually bump into a shoe.
Oh. What?
You can see the time of paradise in the garden as a certain kind of childhood of the human mind. That everything was provided for us, we could just receive, right? And that was beautiful. We call it the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And it's described as the thing that enables you, like, the wisdom to be able to differentiate or like distinguish between, or like make judgments about what's good and what's bad. And then there's this moment of being like, maybe I could make it better. And so we look back at this question of like, what were they thinking? And I started to ask it a different way, and I was like, she's thinking. That's what's new. I stumbled across a thinker by the name of Julian Jaynes, who's a neuropsychologist and has written like a far-reaching paradigm about what consciousness is, like what thinking is, and when and where and how it comes. And I started looking back at the story through that lens, and he says that basically about 3,000 years ago, you're at the beginning of an internal conversation, which is like this shocking development. And the beginning of the possibility of, instead of just receiving from the outside, and instead of feeling connected with everything, starting to question or starting to think. So Jaynes argues that this is the very beginning of what becomes a sense of self. And specifically, the suffering was not something they chose, but this change in brain anatomy that happened, that suddenly they couldn't just receive the glory from everywhere, but they started asking questions, and that itself was a suffering. I'm wondering if that's a guide in that direction. That's certainly the narrative in Buddhism, that like the questioning itself is the suffering. And that like that can be the leaving of the garden. And then the fall from grace represents the beginning of adolescence, like we call it puberty. And we start rebelling against the parents.
And so Cain and Abel is a story of two brothers, or perhaps two brother nations, one of whom is an agriculturalist and the other one is a herder, or like a nomadic shepherd kind of figure. And both of them give offerings to God.
So like we're thinking of this, like looking back at the anthropology of the agriculture. And like as far as we know, looking back, this is a thing that happened, right? Like agricultural people started spreading and conquering in a way that wasn't done before. Like there was evidence of warring between tribes, but kind of like skirmishes, like border battles. And upon the birth of agriculture, you're starting to get this like conquering land idea and like growing and spreading and colonizing and amassing.
Well, who are these people? Why are they living this way? Why did they leave paradise? And why are they killing us?
What happens with Cain and Abel is like Cain is an agriculturalist, and later he becomes a city builder. And so later in Egypt we have like, this is like the logical extreme of like where Cain goes to. And Egypt is this like really powerful society, right? They're amassing grain, they're growing grain, and they're building these storehouses. And they're taking land and taking land and taking land, and it wasn't only the Jews who were slaves. As we see, like, I mean, Naomi Klein has pointed this pattern out in the shock doctrine. People with money will make more money, whether times are good or times are bad. The ability to accumulate accrues more and more power to it. So Joseph tells this story like, you know, it's going to be bad, let's store up, like, it just sounds like prudent financial advice. But once we see that, like, Joseph obtains buys all the land for Pharaoh, it starts to look like the subprime mortgage crisis. Like, all the Egyptians were slaves, it wasn't just the Jews. We were actually like better off for a while because we were protected by this one leader who was like family, right? But then this other Pharaoh comes and he's like doesn't really care about Joseph. He's like, no, they'll be slaves too. So like it's our story, so we tell the story of our suffering. But I think if you like pull the lens back for a little bit and take like gender social context perspective, yeah, it's like this is how slavery happens. Agriculture permits accumulation because you can grow enough of what you want and you can dry it and you can stick it in a building and then you're rich. If you're a hunter-gatherer, you can collect all the fruit you want and in 2 days all you have is rotten fruit. So you're a part of everything because what you take in goes back. And there's no accumulation and there's no hoarding. There's no ability to just get more and more and more. And then the fall from grace represents the beginning of adolescence, like we call it puberty. And we start rebelling against the parents. And we start destroying the world, slowly but surely. And we're using all these new things that we have, like this thinking power, like power over other people, and like deceitfulness, James talks about a lot. And we're like really using those things. And it's this like party phase of the left brain, or like, you know, or like the logical faculty, the masculine side, dominating the receptive, creative side. And I think that at this moment in our history, we're starting to turn toward adulthood. They could have left after having experienced Cain and said, let's go back to the garden, right? Or they could have said, like, let's go back to being Abel. Like, we've seen what happens here, this is crazy. And they don't. They get this book that's like a farmer's almanac. Like, once you've lived Cain, it's like, okay, like Cain won. Like, Cain killed Abel. It's Cain's world now. Like, you're not gonna beat ancient Egypt. And maybe you're not even gonna be able to run. Like, maybe the next, like, as Yao was suggesting, the story of the famine isn't just like in there because it's a big drought, but it's because, as we see happening like over and over throughout history, conquering peoples will spread and push like less conquering people onto ever more marginal land. And like droughts and famines often have a political background that things would have been okay if not for this competition over like increasingly scarce resources because someone is taking up more than their share. And so it's not even clear that they can be able again if they want. Like, Cain has won. This is Cain's world now. And we're living in Cain's world. And so I start to wonder whether like the Torah as this farmer's almanac is just what Aaron was suggesting. Like, here is, it's like, okay, agriculture has happened. Like, we're gonna have to embrace it. But here is a way to not become Cain. And I think that at this moment in our history, we're starting to turn toward adulthood as like human minds and bodies. I think we've seen, like, we've crashed the car drunk enough times, you know, is what's going on. And we finally say, like, maybe it's time to grow up. We're starting to get a sense from some tools that are newly emerging as widespread things. Meditation, psychotherapy, holistic medicine, body work, movement work, that the fall from grace isn't a time where we, like, it's not gone forever. It's actually still within us in a way. But it's time for us now to grow up and become our own parents. Like, give ourselves our own grace. And ensure, like, people are starting to find a sense of being in the garden. Like, flitting in and out of daily life. It's like, oh, I feel connected to everything. Like, whether it's yoga or psychedelics or like the practice of living for love. I think we're starting to heal our originary mental trauma. And in this is planted the seeds of the next human culture. I want to know, and I felt this sense of people trying to pull it from me, like, as miraculously, like in the last 60 or 70 years, all of these like secret mystical cults have opened their doors and like thrust their wisdoms onto the world of like how to like harmonize the human mind and access like really high planes of being. And now this is like something you do like between dinner and movies. Like, for real though, right? Like, people are doing this when they go to yoga classes. For some reason the doors are just open now. And I'm sure that we have something like this. And I don't know exactly what it is or where or how to find it, but I'm curious about how to bring this to the table. I'm curious how we stop being so afraid from the trauma that we've experienced. Stop looking outside so much. And stop doubling down on conservatism so much. And be able to look inside with a kind of like rapt creativity and figure out what our ancestors might have been saying to us now. Like, start figuring out how to have that conversation between the guide who can't see the seeker and the seeker who doesn't know the guide, and be able to like bridge those things. I'm sure it's there, and I don't know how, and this only came because I got so disillusioned in my own religious Judaism, and I'm just speaking out of my own trauma here, and this is as far as we've come, and it felt like we wanted to share.